Hello, everyone. I welcome you to the National Michael Chekhov Association's newest video, the Michael Chekhov Guiding Principle number 4, the NMCA way. And I am Lisa Dalton, the president of the National Michael Chekhov Association. And I am here with...
Yeah, I'm Wil Kilroy, and I'm the VP of the National Michael Chekhov Association.
And with us today, we have Charlie Bowles.
I am Charlie Bowles. I am the executive producer for National Michael Chekhov Association and all things administrative.
So thank you everyone for joining us today. And as you know, we are in the 4th of this series on the 5 guiding principles. The 5 guiding principles are a framework for how to move forward with the Michael Chekhov technique. And when we understand all 5 of these principles, then we are generally more enthusiastic about engaging in the work and more enthusiastic about sharing the work, and we are given clear structures on how to follow the work. And the 5 guiding principles are an integral part of how Wil and I have really structured this, our Chekhov training intensives. And they are, and Wil and I have now been working together for 31 years. And so we have a rich collaboration, and we've had plenty of time over 3 decades to consider these 5 guiding principles. Our 4th guiding principle is a discussion about how we want to be able to utilize every single individual element of the technique, and how when we engage in any singular aspect of the technique, we actually will manifest many, many others. So I'm just going to begin with a reminder for us of the chart of inspired acting. And this chart is a variation of the one that Michael Chekhov hand drew for Mala Powers, who was the executor of Chekhov's estate and who was our co-founding partner. And she taught with us for our first 18 years of the Chekhov theater training. And she, in her position as executor of the estate, managed to get this publication on the technique of acting published in 1991. And with that, we have the first time in print where she revealed the original chart that Michael Chekhov drew for her as an outline of the sum total of his technique. And over the years, Mala and Wil and I began to expand on what was placed on the chart, because what we wanted the chart for was that an artist could view the chart and be instantaneously reminded of all the potential areas, all the possible tools. And you could, in fact, carry that around, which is why you get a laminated chart when you attend the program. And what Mr. Chekhov explained to Mala was that when we are in these states of inspiration, we are in this center point, and it's very much like the sun, and it lights up like the sun. And that state of inspiration, which Mr. Chekhov also says are the moments when you are happy on the stage, those states of inspiration are fleeting, and the entire technique is designed to help you be able to create a fertile field to receive that inspiration anytime it comes. And if we prepare to receive it, then the likelihood of receiving inspiration increases greatly. And so, as he explained, that any single element of the technique is itself a a point on which you concentrate. And when you concentrate and put all of your energy, all of your focus unified toward a single field, toward any one of those tools or boxes, you could say, when all your energy is unified toward that, then you are replicating the energies that are present in these peak performances. And that truly increases the likelihood of you having this inspiration flow into you, and not just flow into you, but to flow through you and out into your colleagues, into the audiences, out into the world. And that, of course, is central. If the inspiration comes in and it can't come through you, then the artist suffers a great deal of pain. That was a really big problem for me when I would get these great ideas and they would get stuck in my body. So the first guiding principle really speaks about how the psychophysical exercises will help you free your entire being to receive and radiate out what it is that you are, what you're inspired with. So focusing on any single one of these tools can turn it on like a light bulb. Your concentration is a spark, and that spark, through your focus, through your will force, ignites this energy and shoots it into the center and then lights up everything. All the boxes tend to light up like a marquee. And this was the central idea that Michael Chekhov gave to Mala Powers, that by focusing on mastering each individual tool, we increase the likelihood of us coming into a peak performance. And today, so that's a central concept here, but today one of the things that I'm excited to talk about is how, a little more specifically, how when we focus, for example, on centers, what else happens, so that we can explore a little bit more about how, when we engage in one single tool, we awaken many, many others. Will, would you like to share some thoughts on that?
Okay, so obviously, if you're working, let's say, on a leading center, so you've moved the center somewhere, that might influence how you're then doing an archetypal gesture, or it might all of a sudden give you the feeling that you're going to be flowing or flying because of that center has now dictated your physicality and is changing your energy level. So I think even just the smallest choice like that, all of a sudden these other things, once you know the chart and you practice them, come into play. And I wanted to say that with my students, and I'm teaching stage movement online right now, of course, which is a good challenge, but we were working on a clowning segment, and we were working with clowning archetypes, and it might be on the NMCA site right now. But let's say, for example, they're doing the poor soul clown that nothing ever seems to go right for, even though they try and they try. And without prompting, they were then feeding back to me how when they were working on that poor soul archetype, that, oh, they thought the center was in the middle behind them, and how they felt like they just wanted to mold because things weren't going right. So they were describing what was happening for them in creating an archetype in clowning through the Michael Chekhov tools, because that was lighting up for them several things, even though they weren't focused on precisely a Michael Chekhov technique. So I thought that was really remarkable and wonderful that the students obviously have let this technique seep into them and to be able to feed it back like that.
Excellent. I'd like to open it up to if there are any thoughts from our guests today. All of our guests are NMCA Chekhov Training Intensive alumni. Many of them are certified teachers and or candidates. And so we're really glad you're here today. So Jessica, did you want to share something? You told me recently that you did an online workshop. Did you find any, like you were focused on a particular tool, did you find any other tools appear for you just as you were creating your video?
Well, I kept coming, the tools that I used were the 5 points of focus. I see me, I see you, I see the environment, all of those. And some things that kept coming back and sort of spilling in as I was discussing sort of online was the fact that depending on what you use as a focus, if it's your eyeballs, those have a certain rhythm. And I talked a bit about how the rhythm in which you look away at something or you change the focus, sort of combining that staccato legato, also changes the importance of the focus. It changes the information you give the audience. It not only helps them see what you physically see, but it also there's sort of like a subconscious thing that goes on depending on the pace and the timing of changing from one to the next. So if I go from a 1 to a 3, the pace in which I do that change affects what the audience is receiving. Are they receiving a subconscious cue from me or from my character as well as, oh, something has caught my attention? So that kept coming back to that and sort of referring to that in the lesson. So that was nice.
That's great. How about Virginia? Did you want to share a thought?
When I first came as a student, I found that some worked for me. If we're going back to the principle, how one leads to the all, some worked for me much more than others. And it wasn't until I started teaching that I realized the others that didn't work for me worked for some of my students. So now, as I'm sitting here contemplating, it seems to sink in more how the more I go through and try and master tools that maybe don't work necessarily for me now, the mastery of it at least opens more doors through which the inspiration can enter. So yes, I just completed my thesis this past year, and for me, it was easy. And the challenge in writing the thesis was that it was so easy. But that's only after I had gone through 2 years mastering different techniques that now things just started to flow. So I guess I'm sitting mostly with the idea that even if the door is locked for you right now, it's worth picking that lock, getting in and cracking it open to at least later on down the line leave room for inspiration to enter.
That's excellent. That's excellent. And one of the things that I love about the technique is sort of that exactly what you were saying, Virginia, that you can keep working and you'll find new layers and new understandings. One of the ideas that I wanted to talk about is just like we always start with the psychophysical exercises in our pedagogy, the expanding and contracting. And the reason is I think it becomes very clear as we go around the chart that that expanding and contracting is within all of the other tools. Mm-hmm. So if we look at molding, flowing, flying, radiating, we can see that we start with earth, and that is the most contracted, and it begins to expand a little bit, and we have water, and then it expands more, and we have air, and then it's even finer, and we have that warmth or fire, light there. And so we can see the whole flow of expanding into contracting is repeated and built into the 4 qualities of movement. And then we can see, again, when we go to the archetypal gestures, such as push and pull, lift, smash, gather, throw, tear, drag, penetrate, and reach, which are the 10 that NMCA uses, although we know there's no finite list anywhere written by Michael Chekhov. There are multiple places where he lists various gestures, so you can have as many as you want, but we use those 10 because they're really, really practical. Mm-hmm. And we also use the guidelines for creating them that include a full body gesture. and with a strong preparation, action, and sustaining, which has in itself an expansion and a contraction. So it's like the inhale of the preparation takes us into the opposite,
Mm-hmm.
open, expanding, and then through a contraction into an expansion again, for example. Open, coming down to the ground in the contraction and expanding up, and the reverse. So over and over again in the archetypal gestures, we are again using expanding and contracting. And we will sort of going back to then the molding, flowing, flying, and radiating, we also have a sense of like push and pull in the molding, right? And we have a sense of lift in the flying. So we start to see some of those archetypal gestures also in the molding, flowing, flying, and radiating. And of course, expanding and contracting is the most primal of it's the biggest grand archetype of gestures. And when we come into our emotional life and start working and we start looking at falling, balancing, and floating, the three sisters, we also, again, we see that there's a different relationship to expanding and contracting and to molding, flowing, flying, and radiating, right? So when we are falling, we have a sort of a contracting that seems to be happening. And we also may have, depending, again, tempo and rhythm, we may have a sense of flying down, right? Of just flying down or floating down or molding down, or not down, it's not really directional, but molding in the fall. So, and then when we go into that floating weightlessly, that sense of being free of the gravitational pull, there is a sense of expanding so far that you sort of even kind of lose your boundaries. So from this fall, which tends to have a contraction in it, to the floating, which tends to have an expansion in it, and the balancing, which tends to have a very strong contraction through the core, struggling, teetering process, and seems to have much more, or sort of earth and fire maybe in it. So we start to see how all of these basic psychophysical exercises all work together. Will, do you want to make any comments?
I just wanted to comment too on thinking, feeling, and willing, because that's what I used in particular for the actors I just worked with in Spelling Bee. And I think thinking is much more contracted. Everything's very narrow and concentrated. Feeling, it opens up a little bit. And then we had a will force, the, athlete kid in the show. So he was using will force, was much more open, and even his posture, so that was much more expanded. So even seeing it in those. And the other, since we had students watching it who had to comment on it, and some of them were familiar with the Chekhov techniques, it was terrific how, and going back to this principle about how one tool can open up the rest, in their commentary when they wrote reviews, they didn't know what we were using, but they might have thought, oh, that was a thinking dominated character. Oh, and they were leading with their shoulders, and they were doing this, and they were radiating this. So they came up with things that we hadn't even worked on really, but I think they were coming through just because, again, those actors knew enough that those tools were working for them, even though they were really using one focal point.
That's great. One time I did a play, and I was cast very late, 2 weeks before we opened, and it was a 2-person show, and I had to rehearse with, it was double cast, and the director was not happy that I was the double in the cast, and decided to direct the other cast and not direct me and my scene partner. So we had to rehearse on our own, with no direction. And he said after he blocked them, we could watch what they were doing and then imitate it. So I called up Jack Colvin, who was one of my mentors and colleagues with the Michael Chekhov studio in Los Angeles, and asked Jack to sit in on a rehearsal. And he said, you know what, just do staccato and legato. When you're doing staccato, you do legato. When she's doing, you just switch. So you're never in the same place, and don't keep it the same at any point. Just do staccato and legato and keep switching it. So I wound up, the other girl quit, and I wound up doing the whole run of the show. And I had a lot of students come from my San Diego studio and from my Los Angeles studio. And I was still just doing staccato legato, even though one of my scene partners didn't know anything about the Chekhov work. And I just kept doing staccato and legato. And then my students would say, oh, I saw your imaginary body, and I saw your center, and I saw you fall at this part. And so what were you doing? I would just say, what were you seeing? They saw all these other things that I was not intentionally doing. And then we got extended. And so then I started trying to remember what they thought I was doing. So, well, let me try what they said they thought I was doing in this section. And so it was quite fun. And it is one of the reasons that any single tool can evoke all the others. One of the reasons why that is so interesting is that one can look at any peak performance and see all of these things in it. And it doesn't even have to be by a Chekhov trained artist. You can see the gesture in it, you can see the atmospheres and things like that. So I have lots of more things I can say about how something as simple as expanding, contracting affects the other tools, but I'm curious what some of you guys, can you see it? What are you seeing? Can you see how expanding, contracting, for example, is manifesting in some of the other tools we haven't spoken about yet?
The thing that really strikes me the most about the tools are that they are, each of them in their own as an entity, are so archetypal that they take on a life of their own. And people begin to look like they are using those tools, even though we know they are not. A couple of years ago, I spent a little time watching a bunch of movies, and one of those was Sling Blade. And the aha for me watching that movie was that in almost every scene, I could identify clear, obvious Chekhov tools that Billy Bob was using throughout the entire movie. I don't think there was a single scene that he was in that did not have some tool you could identify. And I was so excited about it that I went and studied him more and his process and read interviews by him about that movie, and came to realize he had no idea what the hell he was doing, and he had no plan to use a single tool ever. He couldn't have mentioned a single tool of Chekhov or whatever, and yet they were so clearly obvious as he was doing them that I came to realize that what he was doing was tapping into the archetypal variations of each of those tools, and whether he knew what he was doing or not, they were there and we were seeing them. And I think this is an important thing that we can look at for teaching, because we can point to, in fact, we often do point to things in nature, trees that clearly have some kind of a character, tool when you look at it. And of course, you know that the tree is not sitting there focusing on being itself. It's just there.
I can say that I like the idea in an ensemble of thinking about it in terms of expansion and contraction. You could expand it, the ensemble feeling, out to your stage crew or your film crew, your audience, your test audience. I mean, you can expand the idea of ensemble very far, or your ensemble can be like the 3-person you're working a Zoom scene on with. Like, it can be a very tight, contracted ensemble, allowing no one in but your scene partner. I like that idea.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And that stimulated just talking about atmospheres, because I can imagine that if we consciously expand our ensemble, our sense of ensemble, we will create instantly some kind of atmosphere. And we also, just atmospheres in general in relation to expansion and contraction, we can sense the molecular structure of that atmosphere as being somewhere on that scale of expanding and contracting, and its impact on us, that our response will lead us to a greater contraction or a greater expansion. If we're really in tune, we'll feel that the pulsing of the atmosphere, and it's changing.
I'd like to jump in going forward from what Mary said about ensemble, because she had this experience, hopefully, when we did the Deeper by Demand in New Mexico and we created an original piece. I think in that piece, that flow of contraction, expansion had to happen and naturally happened when it was performed. So sometimes it was 1 or 2 characters with a focus. Sometimes it had to expand to the whole group and everybody was reacting. Then to tell the story, it had to come down over here. So, I mean, it used focal points, but it also used expansion, contraction, and obviously radiating certain qualities of energy. So I'd be curious, Mary, if you want to pick up on that, to see, did you indeed experience that with that particular ensemble? Because I thought it was very strong for that.
Only now that you mention it, Will, because I hadn't thought about it like that before, but of course that's what was happening. It would even happen, I suppose, encompassing the audience as well. Sometimes only a couple of them were with us. Sometimes all of them were with us.
That's true.
We've already spoken about some of the characterization. Will's talked about thinking, feeling, and willing. And so we're still just looking at how expanding, contracting is permeating here, right? That when we go to our centers and we go to our imaginary bodies, they will all have whatever the images that we're using. In the center, we have a location and we have a quality and we have a degree of mobility. Is it in motion or is it stationary and fixed? And all of those will have a certain kind of expanding and contracting in them, as well as in the imaginary body. The body itself will have a certain degree of expanding and contracting, how it moves through. And so that's the whole concept of characterization. Also was something that we don't speak a lot of in the initial CTI, is more for advanced work, but the concept of disguises and the mask of the character and what the character is showing, what the character is really going on inside the multi-dimensional conditions of what the of two-faced characters, basically. and those looking at the idea of being contracted inside and expanded outside. A character like Iago might be a really classic example of someone who might be very contracted inside and appears to be much more expanded on the outside. So again, all this to say that one could render a moment of or render the character through a multitude of these techniques and appear to be using something completely different than what you are, because they are all percolating. Wil, did you want to talk a little bit about tempo rhythm in relation to this, maybe?
I think you've touched on it, and some of the other speakers, but tempo rhythm obviously is present in all of these as well, depending on what your choice is. As you just talked about characterization, your character is going to have a certain tempo, and maybe they do find a rhythm to their movement. So that's going to work obviously in character. But I think even if you're using archetypal gesture, and let's say you're using it as far as an intention, my intention now is to push this person away. Again, are you pushing them very gently? Maybe you're pushing them out of the nest, or are you pushing them with anger? What quality do you add to it? That's going to change as far as what the tempo is, and also give a certain rhythm to it. So I think, tempo rhythm also, as you're saying, is infiltrating every other tool.
So I have a question. Is this conversation helpful? Are you starting to see some value to how you can work with these when you start just leading the imagination with asking, how does utilizing this particular tool trigger the others? In what way can these all work? How are they so interwoven? Do you find this an interesting and useful or potentially useful concept? Is it giving you something, a new insight or a new way to look at the tools?
I think that now when I'm hearing those things, I will see things differently, because it was in my mind, this guiding principle, and I tended to think, okay, it says Chekhov said it because it gives inspiration. When you focus on one tool, it gives inspiration, but I don't really believe now that everything is lightened up. But when we are analyzing this, it's genius, because I'm now trying to think if I will initiate it. So I'm trying to start with just thinking about exercises. I'm thinking about the personal atmosphere, and now let me try with the personal atmosphere. It will lead me to a gesture, and then the gesture leads to a whole atmosphere, the objective atmosphere, and then it will rise as archetypal, or not archetypal, MFFR, molding, flowing, flighting, radiating, and everything is connected to everything by definition almost. So it can be. It's very inspiring now.
The concept of you don't have to understand all of this for this to work for you is a comforting thought for a new actor or a novice actor. Every once in a while, one of these techniques is slippery as you're teaching it, and you just can't grasp it, but it doesn't matter. I think that's probably comforting if you're new.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to jump in and say, off of that, my students tend to get very ambitious. So they're doing a scene and they want to do it all. So they're going to have an imaginary body with a center, and they're going to be pushing, and then they're going to be falling, and then they're going to be thinking. And I tell them, you cannot do that. Your mind doesn't operate that way. Pick one tool and trust that the others will be there. And I think that's a little hard for them at first. But then when they do it and afterwards they realize, oh, I didn't realize in that moment I did kind of fall, but that's not my focus. So yeah, I like what Mary was saying, is that if they can realize and trust that the tools will be there for them. They don't have to overload themselves trying to do everything all at the same time, which is not possible.
And as well, they don't have to depend on a tool that they are struggling with. Therefore, they can pick another tool and they'll come back to that tool at some point, either through no control of their own, or at some point they'll begin to see some sense in that tool that they are struggling with. And it gives you the ability to completely trust in the one thing that you are doing and know that something else is happening. If you go back to day one of CTI, the very first thing that we do is lay on the floor contracted. And some people on this call are often questioning sometime later, how did you feel? What was your experience? And almost all of us would say, well, I was sad when I was contracting, or I was, elated when I was all contracted, whatever. We came up with all kinds of explanations for some kind of feeling. Well, of course, the tool itself did not create the feeling, but it triggered other sensations, which are part of other tools. And so those may well have come to us in the course of performing that tool. And it's within our nature to say, well, that tool caused it. What we know is that contraction and expansion is purely archetypal and does not create. In fact, if we listen to each other, some of us were sad for, or happy on the same tool. So it's clearly within our emotional response to that tool that, where those answers come from.
Yeah, so we're really appreciating the creative individuality of the artist as a as the central point here in terms of the uniqueness of how we might respond to any given one of these. And it also leads me, this discussion has led me to want to remind us or share, if this is new for you, about the 80-20 path to strengthening your skill sets. The 80-20 rule, so to speak, is that if you needed to go out and utilize a particular tool or set of tools, if you had an audition or you had a class to teach, while we want to become masters of every single element of this, because they are all useful, it would be not to our advantage if we spent 80% of our time focusing on trying to get better at the ones we just don't get. So we do want to improve on the ones we just don't get, but it's much smarter for us to spend 80% of our time working with the ones we really do get. And bringing those two. If we have to go on an audition, I'm going to use the tools I know and understand. If I have to go teach a sample class, I'm going to use the tools I know I understand. If I'm going to create a curriculum that's going to include Chekhov, but not the entire pedagogy, I'm going to teach the ones I understand. But on my own, my other little 20% of my development time, I'm going to work on strengthening the areas that I'm not familiar with. So that when we're actually out in the field, actually applying, we're going to keep building our strengths, because of this guiding principle number 4, because everything is unified and it's like a hologram. Each one of these is a hologram that contains the whole. of the technique. When you become super great at expanding and contracting, and if you don't understand some other tool as well, if you start to look at that tool and say, well, gosh, I'm great at expanding and contracting, where is expanding and contracting in that tool? You will start to understand that tool more effectively. So if I really love centers, for example, and I don't get imaginary bodies at all, I can just really focus on centers for my characterizations. Where is it? What is it? Does it move? And the more I become strong at allowing those centers to inspire me and stay vital and pulsing and living, if I ask the question, how is imaginary body relating to me? I can start to expand, and that 20% of, just leading my imagination with the question, how does imaginary body connect to a center? Maybe when a logical time to use an imaginary body is when you have a voiceover, for example, of a cartoon, or you're playing a historical character and you have actual portraits of the people, or they're still they existed since video and you can actually study their movements and not just their visage. You can start, instead of trying to put on that imaginary body, for example, you can really start to look at where the center is and sense into where the center is. And eventually that will produce an imaginary body and a gesture and a personal atmosphere and a degree of expanding, contracting, a sense of molding, flowing, flying, radiating, a predominance of thinking, feeling, willing. Everything will come through that particular thing. So I hope that's helpful to just to remind yourself, if you're building your skill sets, you want to build the ones that already have a good footing, and the stronger you get in the ones you're really good at, the more the ones you're not so good at will naturally rise. And with just a 20% of the time that you're in your development, you focus on the weaker ones, you will upscale the entire process. Otherwise, if you didn't focus on your strengths, so let's say these were not so good and these were really strong, and I just keep focusing on these, I go like this. Can you see that? So I'm not delivering work up at this level. If I really spend, 4 times out of 5 when I'm practicing, I really do the ones that I know well, they raise. And then the work that the world sees, the work I'm bringing out to the world, is up here. And this is gradually lifting. Does that make sense for everybody? This idea of the 80-20 rule. You spend...
It's actually very comforting because I ignore psychological gesture like 90% of the time. So if I just gave it 10% more, maybe I'd figure it out.
I do have a new video out there from the Global Chekhov.
I know, I saw it. It's on my list.
Good.
I wanted to throw out, because Ophir sparked this, and I think this guiding principle also relates to more of our worldview or connection to the human spirit view, like when he said something about all is in one is in all of that. And it's also the quantum physics part of energy, where if the butterfly is flapping its wings in Hawaii, I'm feeling it in New Mexico. There's some connection like that. And I actually feel during this time when we're isolating, but in that isolation, we're doing all these other creative reach outs, that is happening more. Or I know for me, I was brought to tears seeing the video of the New Yorkers who all at 7 o'clock gather on their balconies and bang their pans and thank all the essential workers, and that's happening in this big city that's sometimes known to be a more rude, impersonal city. So I'm kind of seeing this principle about how one can ignite all play out in a more worldly form. And even in talking to my students this morning in class, I was asking them, what's a positive that you see in all of this? And they were kind of mirroring that same idea, that they felt that maybe after this, there would be more of a connection, there would be more support, there would be more empathy. So I will just hold that vision of what this could bring to us.
Yeah, that makes me want to talk about the four brothers of beauty, ease, entirety, and form, and how they can be so inspiring. And just in particular, the feeling of beauty. When we talk about being building our skill sets with these tools, that beauty, ease, entirety, and of the form, it's exciting for us to recognize which of these tools do we have a greater feeling of beauty for, and what is it about that? Do we have a feeling of, is it we like this better because we have an ease, comfort, we feel confident in the form, that we understand the form of that particular tool, and ones that we don't feel very much ease for, we sort of don't really look at, we forget to include them. And so just remembering throughout that just concentrating on that feeling of beauty for the unknown. If you have a tool that you don't really know, just keep asking yourself, in what way is this beautiful? And it will likely increase your receptivity. So that's one of the concepts, and we definitely will talk more about that, because that comes up in guiding principle number 5. So we'll go more into that. Will, any comments about beef, or anyone else, about beauty, ease, entirety, and form, and how it permeates the entire chart?
One thing that's true is it's a beautiful chart.
Thank you, Charlie.
All right. Yes, I'd love to hear from some of our visitors here about that, what they feel.
I think that we did a lot of these exercises in the training, and you can see, I feel that all the time when you're focusing on one principle of those principles, so everything else, the other 3 are there. For me, it's very clear, because if I'm looking at form and I'm focusing on form, I can see a whole and I feel it and when I see the whole, I get some ease and it's beautiful. And if I'm looking at beauty, so it sparks some kind of form and ease, and they are very connected and very, it's like this guiding principle.
It really is, this set of tools is so indicative of how one plays into the other.
I'm having an issue trying to figure out how to teach the 4 brothers online. That is like a little block that I'm having with my online classes. I'm right at the point where I really need to start discussing it, and I'm not sure how to translate it to an online experience. So that's something that I'm willing to take any ideas about that.
I mean, what comes to me immediately, and different exercises I've been doing, is have them in focal point 1, because that's easy to do because they're by themselves, and just have them move their hand with a sense of ease, and have them study the beauty of the lines that are in their hand, and have a beauty about those freckles on the back of your hand, and appreciating that beauty, and what form does your hand have, and how can it change forms when you move it, and what can you do to create a whole movement, and then pause for a moment, and then create another movement and pause for a moment. So I think even doing it with just the hand in a video could be really effective with those 4 brothers.
I think we can do a basic, object manipulation exercise. So it can be a small object, like a substitute for when we do the chair exercises, but Will has a pen that he's showing, and I have this little barrette clip thing. What is
Yeah, I
that?
could use my spoon exercise as a lead-in.
Yes, yes. So Mary, and actually because the feeling of the whole does have a lot to do with ensemble too. We could talk for a moment about that, Mary. I'll share my little exercise, and maybe we could even try it. But we were discussing this challenge of how to work with feeling of ensemble when you have, the Hollywood Squares look. And the idea was this is an adaptation of Michael Chekhov's exercise, where he has a group, an ensemble group, and we've done this in the Deeper by Demand. An ensemble group needs to, without speaking, make a choice to all sit down, walk forward, or run away. And for example, so my suggestion is that it's the hand on the head, and you can do this with me. The hand on the head, on the cheek, or on the chin. Okay, so that's your option. Head, cheek, chin. Okay, now we're going to start by putting our hand over the camera. And when I say 3, we're all going to put our hand, we're trying to sense into each other from our ideal artistic center. We're going to try to decide as a group. When I say 3, you're going to put your hand in one of those 3 places. 1, 2, 3. That's cool. That's interesting, because we all either came here or here, and nobody went up to the head. That's great. That's great. And so the idea would be that you would repeat this multiple times. Mr. Chekhov says the first couple of times that you do this is probably pretty chaotic. So that's one. And then Mary, would you share your spoon process? And maybe we can just start with a pen.
We can absolutely do it with a pen. So this game is an ensemble. And I make everybody get a spoon. So the idea is I'm going to pass. So Lisa, you kind of put your spoon down, but you watch your pen, and I start to feed it. I'm going to start feeding it to you, and you start to let it poke out from your other side of your screen. Maybe I shouldn't ask the dyslexic person. There you go. There you go.
Charlie,
and then you pick a person to pass it to.
Charlie, you have to, with your screen share, you have to bring it closer to the camera.
And you can go down, like you could pass to somebody else, but you usually call the name out so they know it's coming.
Will.
Yep. I'm going to unmute all, so we're all unmuted.
Oh, that was a good one.
Virginia.
Oh, my pen, it shrunk.
You call someone out.
Jessica.
Lisa.
Finger.
It's almost a mirror exercise. So you'd like kind of go like that.
Which is a little strange on here, because when you look at yourself, your mirror is backwards.
Right.
This is tough.
It is. Eventually you can figure it out though. It takes a few passes. And it's easier when it's a spoon because there's a big end and a small end. So there's somehow more of a And the side to sides are easier than the ups and downs.
And you're
So
doing
side
it
to side.
only online on Zoom, or it's?
Yeah, this is a Zoom game.
There is a
I
setting
might
on your
even-
screen that lets you change your mirror view of yourself so that you essentially make yourself, you look at yourself the same way everybody else looks at you. And so the pins arrive in the right place in the screen. So,
Right.
I have another idea for teaching beauty is entirety and form. I think you only need one etude. I mean, you only need one thing that you're doing, picking up an object and opening and closing and putting it down, and then just go to focus only one. So focus this with beauty, focus this with ease, focus this with form, and you only need actually one etude for this.
Yeah, gonna give it a try.
Any other thoughts on?
there's a great exercise you can do to work on all kinds of beef. It's not an ensemble, it's not an intentional ensemble exercise, but go grocery shopping. It's like almost everything almost happens these days. Almost everything happens in slow motion because you're moving very slowly and cautiously, and you're looking down aisles, and if they're going the right direction, or if it looks like somebody that's masked and you can move by them, and you move closer, and then you kind of find this little spot where you can pass, safely or whatever, and you spend the whole time you're in the grocery store, exercising every form of beef in that whole process.
I think it's a good time to wrap it up. I hope that you guys really appreciate guiding principle number 4. And you know that these guiding principles are on page 79 in your Michael Chekhov playbook. And it's a really good idea to take, to review those and just want to make sure we clarify that it's extremely important when you're working, understanding that one tool contains the larger whole, that you stay with the focus on that single tool rather than trying to do 58 tools at once. I mean, of course, later on, that's your guiding principle regarding how the higher ego unifies everything, that we understand that we focus on rehearsing one tool at a time, that your talent is like a magnet. It will draw to it those sparkly jeweled parts that it really likes, that align through your higher self with the truth of this artistic aim that you've established. So one at a time. Mr. Chekhov says himself, you can use all of these tools, one of these tools, or none of them. So no shame, no uneasiness if you're not using some aspects of it. And but know that when you are inevitably doing some aspect of whatever it is you think you're not doing. Okay, so Mary, for example, is doing psychological gesture even if she doesn't feel completely confident in it. So I'll finish with a short story on that same play where I was just using staccato legato. My producer apparently was inspired by my performance and started reading Michael Chekhov and came to me during the extended part of the run and said, "So, what's your psychological gesture?" And I was mortified because I didn't have a psychological gesture. And so I was just, sort of trying to figure things out. And I realized that I did. I had one all along. But I hadn't known until someone asked, what is it? Because I never asked, what is my psychological gesture? During final dress rehearsal, the set was not finished. We actually opened with an incomplete set. And I stepped in onto the set from stage left and took my position immediately on the left edge of the wall of the set, which is my start point. But I hated that. And before, there had been no wall there. So I was always coming in from the other side of the stage. And what I realized, 10 weeks on, was that the reason I always came from the other side of the stage was because in the dark, I had to walk tiptoe over wine bottles, lingerie, empty Chinese food boxes, and all kinds of things that I could break my ankle and make lots of noise in. And I had to do that in the dark once the set went dark. And that process of tiptoeing and trying not to break my ankle was actually the psychological gesture of the character. Yeah, that was a perfect metaphor for her entire situation. So ask and you shall receive the information. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We are so grateful. We will be back same time next week for guiding principle number 5, and we'll look forward to you joining us.
So thank you for all showing up today.
My favorite person is...
One minute on your imaginary bodies.
We took a scene from Golden Boy. We all did the same scene.